My name is Matthew Lang, and I run the IC Foods. Some of you may know it as IC3, which is the International Conference Consortium and Center for Food Ontology, Operability, Data, and Semantics. And I'm here to tell you today about the emerging Internet of Food and the role it can play in digitizing food, flavor, eating, drinking, and even pleasure. And for the purposes of essentially environmental sustainability, personalized products. You've heard a lot about personalized products over the last 2 days. And again, wellness and happiness. And I'll expand upon each one of those things in just a little bit. If you want to reach me on social media or even on Gmail, you can hit me at Mateo Lan. That works for Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or you can just use traditional email. So really, essentially, when we start talking about the Internet of Food, it's not just the kitchen, right? This is food across environment, ag, food, diet, health, knowledge spectrum. We're talking about food in relationship to all of these aspects, right? So the Internet of Food at its core is a language, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And essentially, I want you guys to start thinking outside of appliances and start thinking about individuals and exposures over time and what food really does for us across environment, ag, food, diet, and health. At its core, we see the Internet of Food as a common language and infrastructure, and which really makes for a pre-competitive platform to operationalize data on that knowledge spectrum or value chain. So you guys have probably seen all this, right? World's largest company, no vehicles, most subscribed media company, largest accommodation provider, largest retailer with no inventory. Everybody knows that one, right? It's not Amazon. It's Alibaba. So we even have to start thinking outside of our white ethnocentric thinking. Well, what's it going to look like for the world's largest food companies? What's it going to look like for the world's largest appliance companies? What's the magic here? Well, the magic is all about data, language, network, and interface. Now, originally that article was really saying it was all about the interface, but you can't have an interface unless you've got data, a language for interpreting that data, and a network. So if we think about data that we have around food, one kind of data that we have around food and flavor and aroma is something like what's called mass spectrometry or gas chromatography linked with olfactometry. I can get a peak of certain molecules that come off a machine, and I can associate that with a banana smell or a lemon smell or what have you, and I can learn about that. I can also ask people what they think. How do you sense the taste of a particular food? Is it crunchy? Is it salty? What descriptors do you use to describe that glass of wine, right? So these kinds of descriptors will allow us to essentially build a language. So right now, the state of the art for building a language around flavor and aroma is these things. We have a wine wheel. Maybe some of you who are wine aficionados have seen the wine wheel. It was actually invented by Ann Noble, a professor at UC Davis. But since then, we've got beer wheels, chocolate wheels, coffee wheels. And, you know, I looked at this coming back and getting my PhD at UC Davis after being an information architect for several years for a large Fortune 50 conglomerate. And I looked at this and I said, we need to literally stop recreating the wheel. I mean, it's just a joke. This is the state of the art. The coffee wheel was just on one of the premier journals for flavor. So I asked you earlier, let's think outside of the kitchen. Let's think about food before it gets to the kitchen. Let's think about food after it leaves the kitchen and goes inside your body. Because really, it's not about just building a language for your appliance. It's not just about building command and control on, off for your appliance or spin, but we need to actually annotate those things for what's going to happen to the food, right? So if we think about the network of the people who are involved and the industries that are involved in actually making food, We need to start building vocabularies that actually, this is an ontology of industry, where we took the NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System, and turned this into an ontology. So we can start looking and assigning, well, exactly, what is the chicory farming industry? What are their inputs? What are their outputs, right? How can we start using the stats that governments collect around industry and use that to actually annotate aspects of food, right? What are the energy requirements? Same thing with food processing industry, right? Same thing with the machines that are used in each one of these industries. Now we got to ask ourselves, can we actually annotate each one of these types of machines that exist inside of industries for specific, flavor components, nutrient components, energy usage, influx of materials, efflux? What can the efflux from those processing streams actually gain? Right? My wife is a scientist, and her claim to fame, she runs a mass spec lab at UC Davis, and she found oligosaccharide molecules that grow specific gut bacteria. She found these oligosaccharide molecules that mimic human milk oligosaccharides in bovine cheese whey that's left over. It's a waste product that the dairy industry doesn't know what to do with. She found human milk oligosaccharide analogs in cheese whey. Now that cheese whey is worth gold. So what kind of, how can we do this for all kinds of food industry and foods that we make at home, right? So that we don't have waste streams. So if there's any Swiss people in the audience, you'll remember that it wasn't that long ago that one of your colleagues, Tim Berners-Lee, came up with the idea for hyperlinking food and made the first web browser in 1990. And that was really the advantage of hypertext markup language, the beginning of the web, right? The web was all based around this. Uniform resource locators and hypertext markup language, right? So these links go to a specific place, right? Well, what's it going to look like? Come on. If we have a hyperfood markup language. So instead of annotating for bold, italic, trebuchet font, right, HTML, what if we're annotating for grown under these conditions, harvested under these conditions, sliced, diced, chopped, peeled, canned, delivered at this temperature, right? Annotating food along the way. What is that going to look like? It's not actually going to be a markup language. It's going to be an ontology, a structured vocabulary. Those vocabularies that I showed you earlier are ontologies that we've made around food industry. And it's going to involve building ontologies around phenotype. The phenotype of an organism we're used to hearing about, right? So you may have a genotype, big B and little b for your eye color, but your phenotype in that case would be brown eye color. So it's what we see, it's what we can measure, right? It's the interaction that results from your genes and your environment, and it's what we can see. It's not what your genes are made of. So what if we had phenotypes for food? How would we do that? Building a language around food phenotypes, and not just a specific food, but food as it moves through the value chain, the supply chain, right? So that we can give appropriate advice to farmers or home gardeners about the ecosystem that they need, or the climate that they need, or the soil that they need to grow a specific genotype of wheat, right? And then from that wheat, we can phenotype it. Now, the state of the art for phenotyping wheat these days is for pest tolerance, pest resistance, drought tolerance, right? So we don't annotate wheat for the crunchiness of the croissant that you can make from that, right? But if we build a language that moves across phenotyping flour, phenotyping dough, and phenotyping each one of these things, which we're doing in my lab, actually. We're working with a large grain company to do this. CT scans of bread, MRIs, right? Viscoelastic properties of the dough, right? So how far do you stretch that dough before it actually breaks? We're measuring all of these aspects of dough and breads. So here's, in fact, a model of the food phenotype ontology, right? The base classes, the root classes, because these are hierarchical, these ontologies. That's where it breaks down. It's not a markup language, it's an ontology. So we can annotate things with specific properties. We've got physical properties, chemical components and properties, biological components and properties, and most importantly, what's called organoleptic, How do we sense this food, the aroma, the odor, right? The sound, the taste. I walk through out there on the floor and I hear lots of people talking about, oh, I've got this sensor and it measures humidity. And it'll tell you exactly the humidity that's in your drawer. It'll tell you exactly the temperature. Well, that doesn't mean anything if I don't know what's the best temperature to store my spinach at. It doesn't mean anything if I don't know, gosh, in my drawer now is a tomato. Fix that for the right temperature and the right humidity, right? So we need to know about the food. It's not just about the appliance, right? So we have a crop ontology, and a subcomponent of that is the wheat ontology. And the wheat ontology actually characterizes some amounts of breadcrumb structure, viscoelastic properties, but we're working together with the authors of these ontologies to actually make them better from a food science perspective as opposed to an agronomist perspective. Right? So we can start looking at what are the processes that foods go through in order to achieve a specific sensory experience. Right? So now you can imagine that we've got the food processing ontology here on the left, associating that with the machinery ontology that you saw earlier, which is associated with the industry ontology, right? So now we can start thinking about, well, what are the sensory experiences that I can achieve from processing specific foods in specific ways, right? So we look at the inputs, we look at the processing, and we can look at the outputs. Now we can actually start AI over all of this and facilitating ecosystems of technologies to emerge, as opposed to, you know, a single company owning everything. There is also an ontology that exists now called Food-On, and I'm a co-author of this ontology, and it's emerged, and it links, among other things, multi-species anatomy ontologies. I had to let them know that, you know, we don't eat pig scapula, you know, we eat pork shoulder, right? So there's a few things where the anatomy ontologies don't map in exactly, right? But we want that level of precision, right? Cooking methods and preservation methods need to be transformed into food processing ontologies. These are a couple of my students working on dough phenotyping and computational models of flavor, which I'll get into in a second. And Kimi Itaji is working on eating and food consumption ontologies. What kind of meal are you eating? Is it a feast? Oh, it's a feast. What kind of feast? Is it a religious feast or a secular feast? Oh, it's a secular feast. Is it associated with the moon or with the sun or a specific time of year, right? So once we start dialing in on this, now we've got really good, what are the flavor components that are associated with those feasts, right? So we can ask questions about culture and ritual and religion about food that we've never been able to ask before, and we can really dial in markets, right? So some people want to make these ontologies proprietary, and there's always going to be some amount of the ontology that is going to be proprietary, that's going to essentially encode some of your business logic. But we also need a language that enables people across the value spectrum to share data. And it's a little bit like music notes, right? How great would music be if music notes were proprietary? Right? How great would the World Wide Web be if HTML was proprietary? They would both suck a lot. I mean, it's true, right? They wouldn't even exist, right? So, you know, the magic is in the music, not in the music notes, right? And, I mean, the magic here, you know, every third green line on the top, every third green wave, is in harmony with the red wave. Down here, the C and the F sharp, they don't sound so good together, right? So how do we do this with flavor? How do we do this with foods, right? Flavors and foods that go together well. We can find this, and I think that we can find the algorithms that make this work and the language that we can use to describe these kinds of associations, right? This is a place that's existed in Berkeley since 1970. Custom scenting. I can go in and I can make my own perfume. And this exists in a few larger cities in the world, but these guys have been around, I think, the longest. I can take some essential oils, and in fact, I made my wife's custom perfume. Called it Lavender Leather. And I made it, and at the time when I made it, long time ago, they put it on a 3x5 card, and they stored it in the back, so I could come back and I could get my scent, right? Well, now imagine this happening, but I don't have to go anywhere to get it. I can have everything delivered, right? And it wasn't that long ago that, we heard a little bit earlier about, sort of recreating foods, recording and recreating foods. It wasn't that long ago that the Supreme Court, tough decision, 5-4 decision, to allow people to tape TV programs, right? That's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? And as we digitize food, are we going to be impacting people's livelihoods, right? What about Parmesan cheese, denominated protection of origin? Most Americans don't even know what DOP or DPO, depending on your interpretation, is, right? But it's a European classification that says that, German cheesemakers cannot call a cheese Parmesan cheese if it's not from Parma, right? So, because they haven't used the same traditional methods, the cows haven't eaten the same grass. We've seen the same kinds of things happen with wine and champagne, right? So it's all fine when you're doing the recreating, but then when you decide you've got something magic and you want to market it yourself, how are you going to do that, right? Well, there's actually a model. You can trademark an aroma, right? It's 1990. You've been able to do this. Someone said earlier you can't trademark a recipe, but you can trademark an aroma, right? You can trademark flavors. So all of food, really, you've probably heard in the human genomics revolution, we've got genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics. These are all the omics of measuring you, your body, all of the chemicals and the genes and everything that's making you work, right? On the big scale, we've got the original omics, economics, right? Looking at how money shifts around in our society, right? I think that what we're talking about here is a new science of gastronomics, right? Where we're actually looking at health and livelihoods and environment. Yes, deliciousness, which is probably the most important aspect of food. And we can't forget that food is really huge in our sense of belonging. It is what ties us, perhaps more than anything, to our community. We can change the kinds of partners we marry. We can change our hairstyles, our dress styles. But many of us will still go back to the foods that we've eaten, that we grew up with. So we have these amazing sensors now. You've heard all about it the last couple of days. But they're not just in the kitchen. They're in the tractor. They're in the field. They're in the soil. Supercomputer in your pocket, more powerful than the computers that sent people to the moon. What are we going to do with it all, right? We've got all this we have all this food data that's now being sourced from the Internet of Things, right? All of these sensors. So our vision of what the Internet of Food is really, it's a combination of these sort of traditional data sets collected by governments, collected by food scientists, collected by nutritionists, right? The USDA is full of this. The UNFAO is full of these kinds of data sets. We've got lots of data. We've got private companies tracking what people eat. We've got GS1 data, right? This is all the sort of the traditional data about food. We've also got this Internet of Things, all of these sensors beaming information about food. And then we've got this semantic web, the vocabularies I'm talking about, the ontologies that are emerging, that we can use to tag all of this kind of data. This makes the data interoperable between scientific disciplines, between different people on the supply chain, between partners, business partners. Now, what can happen with the Internet of Things, if I'm tracking my soil sensor, my camera that's on my tomato plant, maybe even climate, I get my degree days that measure how warm it is, I get the radiation sensors. I can tag this Internet of Things data with the semantic web of food data as my tomato grows, and I can lay all of that down in the blockchain through time. Now I have a transactional history of the tomato, right? Now I can query what kinds of climates are best for specific types of tomatoes in combination with soils, in combination with anything else. Maybe the way I pruned my plant. I can capture all of that in a blockchain. So where do we start? We asked ourselves, where do we start, right? This was before coming to the Smart Kitchen Summit. Well, what are the most challenging problems? We said, let's go with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Number 15 is awesome, right? Sustainable ecosystems, essentially. And number 3 is awesome, which is essentially health, right? Those are 2 really good things to go after. And in fact, agriculture and the production of food is the single largest impact on environment. Growing and producing and processing food impacts the environment more than oil, right? and of course, you know, I'll get to it in a second. So when we looked at the FAO and some of the challenges that the Sustainable Foods Program was seeking answers to, they said there's disconnected policy making, there's lack of tools, information, and knowledge, there's limited understanding between nutrition, sustainability, and food consumption, and there's a lack of available data and standards. We said, well, that's perfect. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Build the internet. We want to link all these things. And so I met my colleagues at the Ag Sustainability Institute at UC Davis. In fact, I met them in a bar. I was walking, and I heard someone say, agriculture, ontology, and I stopped, and I said, who are you? We have to talk. And then we worked together to make the International Center, IC Foods. And so what they had done was they had looked at sustainability issues. They linked large sort of abstract issues like drought, not even that, water issues, then drought, then specific kinds of drought, right? So they came up with this framework for integrated issues and then several component issues, and then mapped those with indicators. How well are you doing at achieving more sustainable water practices? How are you doing at achieving more sustainable practices related to putting bad things into the environment? And so they linked these to the indicators. So this is the language. This is a graphic of the language, right? Where the red dots are these large these large integrated issues. The blue dots are the component issues, and the green dots are all of the indicators. There's no data here. This is just a visualization of the language, the ontology for sustainability, right? And we mapped those to specific stakeholders, right? Whether you're a foundation like the Gates Foundation, or whether you're a food company, or whether you're maybe an academic interested in understanding how things work better in the food system, right? Sustainability goal number 3 was about health. Food is the single largest common denominator about health in the top 10 killers, right? You can't see, I think it's not highlighted here, but I'll just go through it. Heart disease, stroke, we've got diarrheal diseases, diabetes, right? Hypertension. 5 out of the top 10 killers, half of them related to food. I challenge you to find anything else that is associated with more of the top 10 killers. This is true worldwide, and it's true in the United States. But when our brightest scientists were tasked with what are we going to do with precision medicine, this was the National Research Council led by the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Engineers, the National Academy of Sciences, right? Smartest people in the country, so they say. They said, what we need is a taxonomy of disease. We need a taxonomy of disease so that we can improve precision medicine. Now, keep in mind, your average physician has less than 0.2 units worth of nutrition training from the beginning of their academic career after high school all the way through to their last day in residency. 0.2 units, right? So they said we need a taxonomy of disease. Why? Oh, for drug development, of course, right? We need better drugs. There's lots of breakout sections in this booklet about drugs. There's food was mentioned 3 times, only because one of the authors worked at the Food and Drug Administration, and it was part of his signature. Yet food is half of the top 10 killers. So it's clear that we cannot depend on I'm going to call it the National Institute of Disease Intervention, right? It's not the National Institute of Health, because health care is about much more than medicine. It's about food care, it's about stress care, it's about sleep care, right? And it's up to us to get food right. It's up to us. I mentioned happiness earlier. There's over 1,000 unique entries in the Unified Medical Language System. These are all of the languages that the NIH assembles to talk about medicine and health. 1,000 entries for depression. And I don't mean like you have a depression in your skull because somebody hit you in the head with a pipe. I mean like feeling bad, right? There's 60 entries about unhappiness. 60 entries about happiness. 40 of those are about unhappiness. None of them are in the clinical vocabularies for the DSM-4 or the ICD-9 or ICD-10 or CPT codes. None of the ones that any of the physicians use. Well, that's just crazy. We know that happiness is important for improving cardiovascular function. We know that happiness is important. So really, what our National Institute of Disease Intervention is telling us is it's okay to eat crappy for a long time because we can drug and cut our way out of the problem. All right, so we're dealt a hand of environment and genetics, and really what we do to play our hand in life is dependent on how we spend our chips on diet, on activity, and where we choose to locate ourselves. What do we expose ourselves to? Radiation or what have you. Right? This is my friend Ahmed Somi. He runs a company called Nutrigenomics. He's also a professor at the University of Toronto. And they deliver personalized genomic reports to dietitians who will guide you through what it means. I'm going to focus on the second one here, gene MTHFR, which I really love, gene Motherford. So the Motherford gene is responsible for translating 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate to 5-methyltetrahydrofolate. You had no idea you were getting a biochemistry lecture here, did you? 50% of Italian women have polymorphism in MTHFR. It's the Motherford gene. And if you are eating lean meats, and if you're getting vigorous exercise, you're driving yourself towards homocysteine. Guess what? That's bad. Unless you're also consuming more B12, more riboflavin, more folate, you're not going to convert that homocysteine into methionine. And guess what? After 25, 30 years, you're going to have cardiovascular damage. Right? So when I say let's think outside the kitchen, let's start thinking about having our food vocabularies of the food that we're eating, that our appliances are making, mapping to our genomics data, mapping to our physical activity data. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to get into it. We wrote a paper about all of the genetic polymorphisms on that pathway and their associations with both disease and nutrients. We also have the ability to interrogate your activity level. This is a portal I built for researchers who are doing investigations into physical activity. This is my activity. Green is me walking, blue would be riding my bike, and gray is driving. And as I drag this bar across here, I can see my activity. You can do this now with Google, I think, your activity stream and Fitbit. It's not new now, but when you can aggregate a bunch of people and you can help them decide what kind of activities to engage in and what kind of foods to eat, then it becomes much more powerful. And so we built an ontology of physical activity so that we can understand what is the type, condition, intensity, and pattern of your physical activities. A language around physical activity, not just a language around drugs, diseases, diagnoses, but a language about health as opposed to disease. We don't have a taxonomy of health. Those guys totally missed it, right? So we sourced all of this from the Compendium of Human Physical Activities, and it contains just about everything that people do. We did the same thing for stress, so we can understand, all right, do you have deadline stress? Maybe that's a good thing, because you probably won't get shit done if you don't have deadline stress. Or do you have post-traumatic stress? Well, that's a bad thing, and that will probably keep you from getting shit done, right? So building and understanding vocabularies around stress. Now we get to food, and I have to tell you that one thing that is happening on January 1, I think marijuana is already legal here in Washington. I know it's illegal in Oregon and Colorado. But in California, that is the big kahuna, and especially related to food. Okay, so I believe that we're going to see a massive change in food as a result of the legalization of marijuana in California. And everybody at my campus is afraid to talk about it because we'll lose federal funding. Right? Okay, so we've got flavors here, but we've also got these effects. Anxious, energetic, giddy, relaxed, timid, aroused, euphoric, happy, sleepy, right? So we know that if we change your gut microflora without giving you marijuana, if we just change your gut microflora and the bugs that are inside of you, we can change these things too, right? And we can change those things through diet. So now, if you can become an expert. You can become a bud tender, the equivalent of a sommelier, right? And you can advise people that don't take that one. You'll be stuck on the couch the rest of the weekend. Or you can advise people like, dude, you want to write a really cool book? I got something for you. Okay, so this is going to change for food. Okay, now imagine, this was a company called Datalogics, Oracle bottom, because they tracked really well. 2 slides left about what people eat. Now imagine that we can characterize what they're eating in terms of the effects that they have, the flavor profiles, all of these things. Capturing more data is going to be better, and having a language that we can use to describe that is going to be better. These are our partners. We're working with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. We're working with, that's Valeria Pesce there. We're working with the USDA National Ag Thesaurus, the Global Agricultural Concept Schema, Tom Baker, Susie Lewis from the Open Biological Ontologies Foundation. She's the originator of the gene ontology. You would not have the genetics revolution, the genomics revolution, without her. We've got Damien Dooley, who's building food on ontology, Marie-Angelique Laporte, the crop ontology, Pankaj Jaiswal, the plant ontology and Plantium, Pierre-Luigi Boutgaig, the environment ontology at Max Planck in Germany, and we're working with folks who are doing economic models, climate models of food, right? Think outside the kitchen. This is a language that can be used everywhere, right? These are a couple of people who came to our conference last year from the food industry, very supportive. Looking forward to more. We're having another conference this year. These are some of our partners: blockchain, partnership matching, artificial intelligence around food, voice-driven data so that you can get rid of, make regulatory compliance easier. Instead of filling out all this paperwork, you can actually just use same languages and meet regulatory compliance. And here's what a food browser, the equivalent of an internet browser, blockchain. I want to view this tomato through time and all its attributes. This is a clip from an encyclopedia chapter that my wife and I wrote together about using her ability to drill into the molecules in food combined with a common language to find targets for happiness and wellness instead of targets for cancer and heart disease, and actually using those to develop new food products. This year at IC Foods, we've got this is just one panel, computing flavor, and I hope we'll see you guys there maybe next month. All right, thanks very much.